Good afternoon, students. This is Professor Martin again. This is the continuation of our last unit on Congress. There are a couple of additional pieces of information I'd like to relate to Congress and have you keep an eye out for their current significance. We talked a little bit about the leadership structure in terms of the committees and also the steps through which a bill has to pass through the committees to reach a debate in the full House in either House of Congress and then finally eventually make its way to the president for signature or veto. I want to talk a little bit about the party leadership instead, not simply the question of the congressional leadership. When I say party leadership, there are different things that the parties do to actually conduct business within their own caucus. Caucus in this case meaning the side of the aisle that encompasses all of their members. Sometimes they'll go by names which are fairly obvious what it is they do. A steering committee, in terms of conducting the party's affairs in the particular House of Congress, is fairly common. Also, they usually have, in either case, something called or something like a policy committee. This one is particularly interesting because it's headed up by a couple of the senators or congresspeople concerned, and it is responsible for doing a lot of the policy research and policy briefing of each of the members of their House to tell them how it is and why it is they should vote in a certain way. So they're sort of the in house think tank, if you will. However, it's also important to note that a lot of this depends not simply on the different bodies within, but also the individuals within. Each party has a leader in the terms of majority and minority leader. We're excluding here for the moment the Speaker, which is a constitutional office which can succeed the President or Vice President, leaving that aside for a minute. But in either case, they are responsible for coordinating the actions of their particular side of the aisle, but they're assisted in it by an office that you probably have heard this name before, but not quite sure what it is, namely a whip. There's majority and minority whips. Now, what a whip is, to a certain extent, what it sounds like, which is to say, whipping the members of their caucus in line. In a sense, it's both a vote counter and it's a bouncer. If you've ever been to a bar, then I think you have an idea of what a bouncer is, and you don't want to be on the business end of what it is they do. And so, at least in theory, a whip is supposed to be the same way. They're the one that corrals the votes from the various members of the caucus and makes sure that they vote the right way. And there are various ways they do that. Personal visits in which you lean on the member trying to explain why it is you need their vote. Questions of making sure that they may get rewarded or punished, not necessarily in terms of direct losing funding for your district per se, but as would you like to continue being a chairperson or a member of a certain powerful committee? Also, each side usually maintains a rather large amount of funding for actually contributing to the congressional races of their members. It could be that if you're not a very good foot soldier in terms of what things you're voting for, you might not be at the front of that list in terms of who they're going out of their way to fund. So there are a variety of different ways in which the whip, so to speak, can kind of make sure that they have a unified set of votes and how easily it is they came by them. However, it should also mention that these are the ones that you hear about in the newspapers, but a lot of what makes Congress tick has nothing to do with those in those specified offices. Specifically, a lot of it happens, well, through people like yourselves. The 2 to 3 thousand people that you see in and around Capitol Hill who do the real legwork. To a certain extent, this is because Congress is in charge of so many things these days. No one member of Congress can really be considered an expert on any one subject area, so they need area experts and they need staff to take care of this for them. To a certain extent, you see the obvious staffers in any given congressperson's office. This will often include someone who's their chief of staff, someone who is a legislative assistant, which is to say, goes to the hearings, takes notes, analyzes what's in a bill, somebody who is their counsel, which is to say, their in house lawyer, But also, you will see a fair number of people who are going to be actually, again, your age, interns. Now, oftentimes these positions are not necessarily paid, but they are done for college credit. And it's a very good way to get your foot in the door when it comes to having a career in government. Now, that can mean you're doing everything from manning the phones at the front desk to actually helping out the different legislative advisors with substantive policy research. But in either case, college students and their equivalents are a key portion of what makes Capitol Hill work. There's those also, not just for the individual congressional offices, but the committee staffs within them. And finally, of course, for people who are high school aged, is something called pages. Pages is a little bit more of a, well, gopher may not be the best word to use, but probably the most functional one for assistance that the staff needs on the floor of Congress. And so a lot of those daily menial jobs are going to come in the hands of pages. So in any case, you're talking about a wide variety, a small army almost, of support staff, interns, pages, and just general assisting officials that make Congress's business possible. Now, I want to move on here to a final topic within the congressional unit that I want you to pay particularly extensively attention to when it comes to your readings. You'll probably hear this term pork thrown around, and usually it's thrown around in a very negative way. Now, first of all, we need to define what this is. And to a certain extent, the term dates back from when you did not have refrigerated cars and trains actually bringing perishable goods back to a given location. In other words, you would have something called a pork barrel, whereby you, in a seasoned barrel in preparation, you stuck things like pork to be preserved for being carried all the way back home. In essence, that's what you can really think of as what pork is in Congress. It is basically the distribution of different federal money, projects, grants, and resources to the different constituents that are from the government's budget. Now, to a certain extent, you can see how this is one of the most essential things that governments do. And I think you want to also realize that this is one of the essential things your member of Congress or Senate does as well, without reference to the political party that they're in. Any member of Congress who does not bring home the bacon, so to speak, in other words, secure the advantages for their district or state that the constituents want, is likely not going to be elected for much longer. Now, of course, this presents sort of the dilemma that no one likes to be seen actually getting more obvious forms of pork because it makes them look bad, makes them look corrupt or self serving. But also, every person in each of the 50 states wants their member of Congress to deliver when it comes to these sorts of things. So there's always been kind of this interesting dichotomy in the way that people in this country have felt about pork and what it is that's actually done about it. One form in particular that gets a lot of notice is because it doesn't necessarily become obvious where it's coming from, and that is what we call as an earmark. Now, some of you who may come from a farming background or you know someone who does, you've probably seen one of those tags that's stuck in the ear of cattle on a particular ranch. This is kind of what we mean by an earmark, which is to say that has marked this particular animal as belonging to a certain farm or ranch or rancher and so on. And what an earmark basically is in a pork sense is the same thing. It is setting something aside for a particular district or state's program that that particular member of Congress has made. Now, one of the things that also you want to keep in mind with that is the reason this gets criticized is because these can be stuck into any given law that's about to be signed, whether or not they're directly related to the matter of that law or not. So, for example, if you had a question of a defense bill being passed, and then someone out of nowhere stuck in language into the back of the bill saying, oh, by the way, this funds the hospitals in my district for the next 50 years. Radical and perhaps unrealistic example, but it's the same idea. The fact that it gets snuck in somewhere, I think, is perhaps the most egregious thing that people have noted about it. However, it's worth noting that pork in general is the way business has been done in Congress for most of its history. And some, you could tell how powerful a congressperson or senator was by their ability to deliver on this. If you will, either in your notes, in your book, or if you want to Google him, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia is a particularly good example of this. If you go to West Virginia, you can find at a couple of universities the Robert C. Byrd Metals Fabrication Center or the Robert C. Byrd Hardwood Technology Center, at least 4 different highways or highway systems, and then my personal favorite, actually a couple of Coast Guard offices and stations in West Virginia. Keep in mind that West Virginia is a state that has no coastline, and yet there are going to be Coast Guard installations there. What's this a sign of? Someone in Byrd's case who is an old school senator who knew how to bring home the bacon, get the goods for his state. He was very good at it and he was very shameless about it. You haven't had too many people be quite that overt since then. But I think it gives you an idea of just how much politicians are willing to do this if they can get away with it, and also to a certain extent how much people are willing to reward them for that. In Senator Byrd's case, he was in Congress for well over half a century. So I think you can get an idea of what pays off in terms of the pork you get and also the people for which you get it, considering that West Virginia is not that prosperous a state and that at the time he first started doing this, severe development economically and infrastructure wise was needed, then I think you could see was rewarded with that by reelection, but probably in many ways appropriately. However, that's not to say that you're looking at something that's clear of potential for abuse. Just to give you an idea, if you looked at 9, 10 years ago, the bottom of the last Great Recession, President Obama and the Democrats in Congress, who controlled both houses at that time, wanted to jumpstart the economy. And the way that they thought it would be necessary to do this is to pass a massive stimulus package, much of money of which would go to local and state governments for what they called shovel-ready projects, infrastructure projects that were on paper, that they were ready to get going, but they just didn't have the funding to do yet. That whole package cost almost $800 billion. How well did it actually jumpstart the economy again? Well, that's not entirely clear. In some ways, I think you could say the most of what it did is it kept things from getting worse in certain parts, in certain sectors. But it didn't necessarily jumpstart the economy probably the way most people were hoping. And a lot of that centered on, given the fact that you have such a large amount of money being spent, there's all sorts of opportunities for all 535 members of Congress to try and siphon off some of that for the benefit of their own districts. And I think you could probably see, to a certain extent, why that was controversial, and understandably so. Now, this comes to the point that I really want you to pay attention to for the readings and questions that I'm giving you for this unit, which is to say, it is very easy sometimes, the larger a piece of legislation is, to sneak in all kinds of pork and earmarks. Well, you just had, in a very short amount of time, a great number of programs, money, bills that have been signed that have to deal with aiding the country during this COVID-19 crisis, helping out a variety of different kinds of businesses and states and local governments when it comes to making sure that they receive assistance to help get them through this crisis. Now, keep in mind as you read the sources I give you, out of everything that's been proposed and spent, how much of that does actually help, it seems? Or is there actually any pork or earmarks in it?